Let's look at naval gunnery, armor and guns in the period of 1650 to 1815. Before the late 17th century, armament was not the central focus in the ship design process, but this changed. As a result, the weight of the guns became a determining factor. The armament would be decided by the function and rate of the ship, usually with some tacit reference to international standards, the armament of the ship's likely opponents. This would set the number of gun ports from which the ship's length would ultimately derive, while the weight of the battery would dictate the structural strength of decks and constitute the most significant element in the calculation of its stability. To give you some impression how important the stability was, here is a sketch of a Danish 70 gun ship at a 7-degree angle, which was the maximum angle for moderate weather and just leaving 1 meter between the waterline and the lower gun port. Generally, firepower became the determining factor in ship design. Sailing qualities and seaworthiness became secondary. Countries like Spain that put an emphasis on seaworthiness or France with an emphasis on speed would build larger ships for the same number of guns to achieve these qualities. But there was no compromise on the number of guns for the ships of the line, which formed the core of the battle fleets. Now let's look at guns. A standard ship gun of the period was the muzzle-loaded smoothbore, which is basically a sophisticated tube that is closed at one end. Usually those guns were cast from iron or bronze. The production of these guns was time-consuming, complicated and thus expensive. Hence there was usually a lack of guns in all navies. A gun in the 17th century was cast with clay molds and a spindle for the bore. Since the mold was broken after the metal was cooled, it couldn't be reused, which means less standardization and also higher cost. Then the bore was reamed as smooth as possible after the gun was proofed, which meant firing it with an abnormal charge and a follow-up inspection for cracks and casting faults. It was ready for service. There were several advancements for reducing the cost and improving the quality of guns in the 18th century. Most notably was the casting of solid guns without a bore. This allowed for a denser, more homogeneous metal. Hence it allowed for stronger guns. Interesting fact, to cut out the bore the gun was turned and the cutter was stationary. This allowed for a smoother bore. In terms of materials, the guns could be from iron or bronze, which was usually called brass. Iron at that time was rather brittle, hence they were usually cast thicker. Bronze had the advantages that it was stronger, rust-free and able to be recast, and also less likely to burst than iron. Yet it had the tendency to overheat faster, which could render it permanently useless if it bulged. Still, why consider iron in this case? While in 1670 iron was 18 pounds a ton and bronze 150. Thus, especially once the battle fleets increased substantially in size, the number of iron cannons increased too. For France, the numbers are as follows. In 1661, 570 bronze guns and 475 iron. In 1699, 1246 bronze guns and 7136 iron guns. In 1768, 186 bronze guns to 7774 iron guns. Of course, this was not only driven by cost, also the major improvements in metallurgy allowed for better iron guns, which ultimately led to the creation of Judas Priest and Iron Maiden in the 20th century, but I digress. The naming and classification of gun types was quite a complicated system. The plethora of type names disguised the division of gunpowder artillery into 4 very basic categories depending on their function and identifiable by the ratio of their length to caliber. The longest gun with about 32 to 34 calibers of length was the cavalry. These guns were intended for long range and usually had a weight of a bit less than 2 tons and a shot weight of 7 kg. With a point blank range of 420 meters, whereas point blank range was approximately the distance a shot traveled before hitting the water when fired at a 0-degree angle. Now the maximum range was 2400 meters, but it was usually an angle that was completely inappropriate for combat. Next is the cannon, with a length of 18 to 28 calibers in the early forms, but with a larger bore than the cavalries. These were medium range guns and the largest caliber were of this type. They had a weight of around 3 tons and a shot weight of about 21 kilograms. The point blank range is given with 170 meters, but sadly I don't have a value for the maximum range. Then there were the Perriers, which originally used stone shots and were mostly obsolete by 1650, but smaller versions with iron shots were still used in an anti-personnel role for some time. It was rather short with 6 to 8 calibers. Not strictly naval guns were mortars and howitzers. They were rarely used in ships, but more on this later. Sadly, there are only limited information on gun performance available, but to give you some impression, in an experiment from 1813, a long-firing 24-pounder ball could penetrate about 0.76 meters of a ship's timber. Over the course of time, culverins got shorter and cannons got longer, thus the difference became less distinctive over time. Additionally, intermediate calibers were introduced, thus the proportions of the guns became more and more homogeneous. Furthermore, decorations of guns were reduced over time. The earlier the gun, the more decorations were common. Also, the various narrow external rings were a holdover from the days when guns were stave-built and needed bands to strengthen them. In the 18th century, the rings tended to become simpler in section and were eventually replaced by steps in the diameter of the barrel, which in the 19th century were further smoothed into knuckles at each swelling. A more important change was the reduction in windage, which basically means the difference between the projectile and the bore. Thus lesser charges could be used and the shots were also more accurate. Yet the reduction of windage had an important consequence. Rust and other damages needed to be kept to a minimum, thus the bores were usually painted or coated. There were various other weapons like the carronade, which was a short-barreled gun with a large caliber. It could deliver more damage but only at closer ranges. Although rockets were used by all navies for signaling, the British used the Gunnery rocket in combat. The main advantage was the absence of recoil. Thus they could be fired from rather small boats. Usually explosive shells required heavy-built bomb vessels. The main disadvantage was the inaccuracy of rockets. These rockets were first used in 1806 and were consequently used in any major engagements in the Napoleonic era by the Royal Navy. Usually they were used on gunboats and fireships. Now let's look at ammo. The most important projectile for this period was the cannonball or a round shot. These were solid iron balls. Now up to the 16th century stone shots were common, which were lighter but also more expensive to produce. The main problem with the iron shot was its limited effectiveness on enemy ships. After all, very few ships were sunk in combat, thus ships needed a lot of guns and a lot of shots. This is also reflected by the continuous increase of shots per gun for the English Navy. In 1650 it was about 35 shots, in the early 18th century 55 shots, and in 1760 the foreign service number was 80 for ships of the line and 100 for frigates. Another major variant was armor used against the enemy ship's rigging, the dismantling shot, and its most common pattern was a double-headed one. Those came in different varieties, like the bar shot, the expanding shot, the chain shot and the star shot. These shots had a short range and thus couldn't be used to stop a fleeing enemy. They were usually used to allow an escape from a superior force. Yet they were used to a varying degree by each nation. In the Royal Navy the allowance was 3 rounds per gun in the later half of the 18th century. The equivalent figure for the French was 10, while a US warship might give over 25% of its ammunition to dismantling shot. For anti-personnel shots there was the grape and the tiered shot. A grape shot was basically a bag full of small rounds. It was later replaced by the tiered shot, which had several rails separated by perforated iron plates. Similar to dismantling shots, the French and US carried more than the English. There were also explosive and incendiary devices used, but they were usually fired with mortars, which were highly inaccurate. Furthermore, since the explosion was triggered with a fuse, which were quite primitive at this time, it was unlikely that a hit would be followed up by a proper explosion at the right moment. So basically mortar fire was useless for ship-to-ship combat on the sea in this time period. Yet it was used against stationary targets like fortresses and ships in harbor. To finish up this section, some information on propellant. Gunpowder, a mixture of saltpeter, sulfur and charcoal, was the sole propellant in use during this period. About the end of the 18th century, a far more powerful powder was introduced, which required stronger guns, but the range and firepower were increased considerably. Powder was loaded in prepared cartridges. These were made of canvas and later around the mid 18th century of flannel. Because flannel was consumed completely in an explosion unlike paper, thus not leaving any embers that could prematurely ignite the next charge. The gunpowder was usually stored in the magazine and the cartridges were prepared in the filling room before they were brought up next to the gun. Now let's look at the loading process. It was as follows. A charge and shot were driven home by a rammer. This was followed up by the insertion of a vat, usually of oakum, to hold the shot tight up to the charge against the rolling of the ship. A priming wire or iron cleared the vent and pricked open the cartridge. Priming powder was added from a horn and the gun was ready to fire. In late 18th century practice, priming tubes and gun locks were used for firing, but earlier a match held in a linstock was applied to the vent. Before firing, the gun was aimed by the gun captain. Elevation was a relatively easy matter of moving the coin in or out, but any degree of traversing needed much more effort with handspikes and crowbars to lever the carriage around. There were no sights and aiming was very approximate. The motion of the ship had a significant effect on where the gun was pointing when it went off, so battles had to be fought at a close range to have any chance of frequent hits. After the firing, the gun was cleaned and sponged to remove unburned powder or cartridge mud. It is important to note that the new cartridge was brought up from the powder room and was not stored near the gun for safety reasons. Now to finish this up, some data on crew numbers. For a 32 pounder in 1674, the Royal Navy assigned 5 to 6 men, which meant effectively 10 to 12 men, but only one side was engaged. For a 32 pounder in 1817, it was formally stated that 12 men should be assigned, of which 10 were used for the heaving of the gun, which had a weight around 2.5 to 3 tons. The number of crewmen for handling the guns were pretty much identical for all navies at this time. Thank you for watching, stay tuned, and see you next time.